Yuran.
You knew all along, and you still let me walk down this aisle?
Do you really think a cheap piece of tool can hide the fact that your sister just stole $10 million of my money to run away with a driver Victor Remington whispered? His strong fingers suddenly gripping Clara's jaw through the delicate fabric of her veil, the very second the priest declared them husband and wife. The opulent flower-draped cathedral of St. Patrick's in the heart of New York City was completely silent, waiting for the romantic climax of the year's most anticipated high society wedding, completely oblivious to the venom dripping from the groom's lips. Clara's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering a frantic, terrified rhythm against her ribs as she stared up into the glacial, unforgiving gray eyes of the billionaire tycoon she had just been forced to marry. She couldn't scream, couldn't run, and couldn't defend herself, knowing that her silence was the only currency she had left to pay for her family's catastrophic sins. The heavy, suffocating scent of white lilies and burning wax candles seemed to close in on her as Victor's grip tightened just enough to be a warning, turning what should have been a fairy tale moment into an absolute nightmare. Smile for the cameras, my lovely little fraud, because from this moment on, your life belongs entirely to me, he commanded softly, instantly replacing his lethal glare with a dazzling, camera-ready smile as he leaned in to capture her lips in a punishing, possessive kiss. The thunderous applause of 500 elite guests erupted around them, echoing off the vaulted ceilings, an ironic soundtrack to her newly sealed captivity. Through the blinding flashes of the paparazzi, Clara caught a fleeting glimpse of her father, Mr. Hayes, sitting in the front row, wiping a sheen of nervous sweat from his forehead with a handkerchief, looking pathetically relieved that his desperate bait and switch had actually worked. He had thrown Clara to the wolves, without a second thought, trading her freedom to cover up Isabella's sudden disappearance and his own staggering financial ruin, leveraging the only thing Clara truly cared about. Her mother was currently lying in a sterile room at Montgomery General Hospital, kept alive by expensive machines that the Hayes family could no longer afford, leaving Clara with absolutely no choice but to step into her runaway sister's custom-made Vera Wang gown. The transition from the suffocating spectacle of the reception to the suffocating silence of the sleek black Maybach felt like stepping from one prison cell into another. The torrential New York rain battered against the tinted windows, blurring the neon lights of Manhattan into streaks of bleeding color as the luxury vehicle glided smoothly toward the financial district. There sat as far away from her as the spacious leather interior allowed, his broad shoulders tense, radiating a dark, predatory energy that sucked all the oxygen out of the air. I must admit, your family's audacity is quite breathtaking, swapping the bride at the last minute when the original one realized the gravity of her theft, Victor finally said, breaking the oppressive silence with a voice sharper than a scalpel. He poured himself a glass of amber whiskey from the car's minibar, his eyes sweeping over her shrinking form with undisguised contempt, thoroughly convinced that she was nothing more than a greedy, calculating accomplice, eager to secure her place in the high society food chain. Arriving at the Remington penthouse felt less like coming home and more like ascending to a beautifully designed execution chamber, floating 40 stories above the miserable city. The elevator doors slid open with a soft, ominous chime, revealing a vast, minimalist expanse of cold marble steel and floor-to-ceiling glass windows that offered a dizzying, godlike view of the metropolis. Victor immediately discarded his tailored tuxedo jacket over the back of a stark white leather sofa, loosening his silk tie with quick, frustrated movements before turning his full, intimidating focus back onto her. Let's skip the bridal pleasantries and get straight to the reality of your new miserable existence, Clara, he announced, walking slowly toward her with the quiet, deadly grace of an apex predator cornering its prey. Clara stood frozen near the entryway, the heavy layers of her silk and tulle dress weighing her down like a physical anchor, her hands trembling so violently she had to clench them into tight fists at her sides to maintain some illusion of dignity. He picked up a sleek black leather folder from the glass coffee table and tossed it carelessly at her feet, the heavy thud echoing loudly in the cavernous, silent room. Inside that folder is a contract outlining the exact terms of your indentured servitude. You will play the perfect, submissive wife in public, and in return, you will endure whatever humiliation I deem appropriate to pay off your sister's $10 million debt. Victor stated, his gray eyes pinning her to the spot. If you breathe a word of this arrangement to anyone, or if you even think about trying to run away like your cowardly sister, the funding for your mother's life support at the clinic will be permanently severed by tomorrow morning. The sheer cruelty of his ultimatum knocked the wind completely out of Clara, solidifying the terrifying reality that she was not a wife, but a hostage trapped in a golden cage, paying for crimes she hadn't even committed. She stared at the man she had secretly admired from afar for years, realizing that the brilliant, visionary tech mogul the world worshipped was in reality a ruthless tyrant consumed by vengeance. Slowly fighting the crushing wave of despair threatening to drown her, Clara bent down and picked up the leather folder, her heart shattering into a million irreparable pieces as her martyr complex took full control. She read the draconian clauses, the ironclad NDAs, and the absolute forfeiture of her basic personal freedoms, knowing that signing this document meant completely erasing her own identity and her hidden life as a brilliant systems analyst. If I sign this piece of paper and give you the punching bag you so desperately want, you must give me your absolute word that my mother's medical care will remain untouched and fully funded, Clara said, lifting her chin to meet his icy gaze, suppressing the blazing fire of injustice burning in her chest. Victor let out a short, humorless laugh, clearly amused by her pathetic attempt to negotiate from a position of absolute powerlessness. You have my word, sweet Clara. As long as you bleed for my amusement, your precious mother continues to breathe, he mocked, leaning forward to hand her a heavy silver Mont Blanc pen. Clara took the cold metal pen, her fingers brushing against his calloused skin for a fraction of a second, sending an unwanted, confusing jolt of electricity straight up her arm. Although she was naturally right-handed, a deeply ingrained habit from her secret, high-stakes coding days compelled her to switch the pen to her left hand to sign formal binding documents, a bizarre quirk she used to separate her identities. She pressed the nib to the crisp paper and signed, Clara Hayes, leaving a very sharp, distinct, and aggressive hook on the letter C. A unique typographic fingerprint, identical to the legendary anonymous hacker who had saved Victor's server infrastructure years ago. Faircrat watched her awkward left-handed motion with a slight frown, noticing the oddity, but quickly dismissed it as the nervous, trembling clumsiness of a terrified gold-digging woman facing the consequences of her family's actions. The digital clock on the sleek wall console silently shifted to midnight, marking the official, inescapable beginning of her customized nightmare in the velvet trap. Without another word, Victor snatched the signed contract from her hands, his expression hardening back into a mask of impenetrable, unforgiving stone as he secured the document in a biometric safe hidden behind a painting. Your new job starts tomorrow morning at exactly 8 o'clock, down on the lowest administrative floor of the Remington Tower. Do not expect any special treatment because down there you are nothing but an entry-level clerk, he informed her, his voice devoid of any human warmth. He turned his back on her, walking toward the master suite in the West Wing, leaving her entirely alone in the vast, freezing living room, with no instructions, no comfort, and no hope. As the heavy oak door clicked shut with a brutal finality, Clara finally allowed her knees to give out, sinking slowly onto the cold marble floor as the massive skirts of her wedding dress pooled around her like a broken, discarded parachute. She wrapped her arms around herself, listening to the relentless rain battering the floor-to-ceiling windows, steeling her brilliant hidden mind for the brutal psychological war that awaited her at dawn. The elevator ride down to the lobby of Remington Tower felt like a slow descent into a subterranean level of hell. But Clara's mind was moving at a speed that defied the physical laws of the space. Her hands resting neatly on her lap were cold and still, but under the surface, her brain was a whirlwind of encrypted pathways and firewall protocols. By the time she stepped out into the chaotic, high-energy environment of the lobby, she had already memorized the corporate architecture of the company she was now a prisoner of. She wore a simple professional suit she had managed to borrow from a thrift store to replace the extravagant, suffocating wedding gown she had discarded in the penthouse. Today, the legendary, ruthless billionaire, her husband by coercion, would attempt to bury her under a mountain of tedious, mind-numbing administrative paperwork, fully expecting her to break within the first 4 hours. You're late by exactly 45 seconds. Victor's voice cut through the clamor of the open plan office like a whip crack, his tall, imposing silhouette leaning against the glass wall of his private executive suite. He was surrounded by a phalanx of junior partners and high-ranking analysts who all froze, their eyes flicking between the terrifyingly calm billionaire and the woman he had publicly humiliated at the wedding of the year. Clara didn't flinch, didn't stammer an apology. She merely adjusted the strap of her bag and maintained a look of cool, calculated detachment that she had learned from years of hiding in plain sight. The subway lines in Manhattan have been delayed by the storm, Mr. Remington, and I am fairly certain that is an anomaly even the CEO of this company cannot override, she replied with a level tone that caused a few of the younger analysts to stifle nervous gasps. Victor's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening as he stared at her, clearly unsettled by the fact that she wasn't currently a sobbing, trembling wreck. He had expected her to be begging for mercy, not correcting him with the detached logic of an equal, which only fueled his desire to break her spirit even further. "Follow me and keep your mouth shut until I explicitly tell you to speak," he commanded, turning on his heel and marching toward the far corner of the floor, where the cubicles for the most junior clerks were located. He gestured to a tiny, windowless workstation that was practically buried under stacks of outdated, unorganized files, a place where professional ambitions went to die. Your task is to categorize, index, and digitize every single one of these physical reports from the last 10 years by Friday. "If you miss a single document, don't bother coming home," he stated, his voice loud enough for the entire floor to hear. Clara sat down in the uncomfortable squeaky chair, staring at the sheer volume of chaotic paperwork that would have taken an entire team of interns a month to complete. As Victor walked away, she caught the smirk on the face of the department supervisor, a man who had clearly been given instructions to make her life as miserable as possible. However, the supervisor didn't notice the slight, almost imperceptible smirk that formed on Clara's lips when she pulled her sleek, high-end laptop from her bag, a machine that, despite its innocent exterior, was modified with an operating system powerful enough to crack the bank-grade security of the very company she was sitting in. She knew that the reason for this absurd workload wasn't just to punish her, but to keep her occupied so she couldn't see the internal emails about the company's failing offshore investments, the very secret her father had been involved in. By noon, the office was buzzing with low-level gossip about the billionaire's wife, but Clara was in a zone of absolute lethal focus. Her fingers danced across the mechanical keyboard, but not to digitize the files. She was actually running a script in the background that was scraping the company's internal network to identify the financial discrepancies. Every time someone walked by, she would instantly switch the screen to a mundane spreadsheet maintaining the perfect illusion of a bored, overwhelmed clerk. She noticed something strange. The files weren't just messy, they were deliberately corrupted, filled with ghost entries that didn't lead to any real revenue, a classic sign of money laundering. She felt a surge of adrenaline, realizing that she wasn't just a prisoner. She was currently sitting at the center of the exact crime scene her father had tried to bury. The lunch break came, and while the rest of the staff headed for the break room, Clara remained at her desk, her eyes locked on the monitor, deciphering the complex web of offshore accounts. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her desk, and she looked up to find Victor standing there, holding a plain paper bag from a nearby deli, looking incredibly annoyed with himself for even doing this. "Eat this so you don't faint and become an inconvenience to my reputation," he muttered, dropping the bag on her desk. Without looking at her, his jaw set in that familiar hard line of forced indifference. "I'm not hungry, but I appreciate the sentiment, even if it's purely performative," Clara replied coolly, her gaze drifting back to her screen. An answer that clearly caught him off guard. He hovered there for a second, his hands clenching, clearly struggling between a desire to lash out and a lingering curiosity about why she was so calm. He leaned in close, his voice a low, dangerous vibration near her ear. As he lowered his head, making sure the surrounding employees could see the intimate posture, which was a brilliant strategic move to fuel the public narrative. "Don't think for a second that this mild act of mercy changes your status, Clara. I am simply making sure the merchandise doesn't depreciate before I decide how to discard it," he hissed, his eyes cold, reflecting none of the warmth she had seen that night in the rain. "Understood, Victor. Is there anything else, or can I return to the mountain of paper you assigned me?" she asked, her voice remaining perfectly steady, even though his proximity was playing havoc with her heart rate. Victor stared at her for a long, heavy moment, his gaze searching her face for a crack, for any sign of the woman he thought he had figured out. But he found absolutely nothing. He stormed off toward the executive elevator, his stride more aggressive than usual, leaving Clara with a pounding heart and a very strange, half-eaten turkey sandwich. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of hidden code and calculated data retrieval, until she finally found the smoking gun, a series of payments made to an account labeled the Ghost Project, which traced back to the exact date of her sister Isabella's disappearance. She felt a cold, sharp dread snake through her, realizing that her sister hadn't just stolen money. She had been part of a much larger, darker game, and Clara was the only person with the intelligence and the proximity to uncover the truth. Just as she was about to save the encrypted file to her hidden partition, a warning beep echoed on her screen, signaling that the network administrator was currently scanning for unauthorized external access. Clara's heart nearly stopped as she initiated a quick kill script masking her activity just seconds before the system locked down, her forehead beaded with a fine mist of cold sweat. She realized that she wasn't just working against Victor. She was working against a security team that was watching every move she made, including every keystroke she was currently recording. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and headed to the restroom to breathe, her mind reeling from the danger of her position. As she splashed cold water on her face, she caught her reflection in the mirror, pale, determined, and terrified, and she knew that she could no longer play the part of the submissive wife. She needed to be proactive, or she would eventually be crushed by the weight of the secrets she was holding. She returned to her desk to find Victor standing there again, his eyes dark with suspicion as he looked at her empty workstation, clearly having checked the logs and found nothing, which only increased his mounting paranoia. "Where were you?" he demanded, his voice low and dangerous, his focus zeroing in on her like a laser beam searching for a target. "I needed to use the restroom. Does the contract restrict my biological functions now? Or is that a new clause you're planning to add?" she retorted, using her anger as a shield to hide the fact that she was currently holding the most dangerous information in the company. Victor took a step closer, his towering presence looming over her, his eyes searching hers for a lie, for any tremor, for any sign that she was doing exactly what she was. "You're playing a very dangerous game, Clara, and I suggest you remember who holds the leash in this relationship before you find yourself completely destroyed," he warned, his voice low enough to be a whisper, but heavy with the weight of an ironclad threat. He was a man accustomed to crushing everyone who stood in his path, but as he stood there looking down at her, a strange flicker of something, was it hesitation, passed through his cold gray eyes. Clara met his gaze directly, refusing to look down, forcing him to witness the defiance he was so desperate to extinguish. "I'm not the one playing games here, Victor, but I am the one who is currently holding the power to change the trajectory of your entire future," she said softly, knowing that this was her first real public pushback against the man who had turned her life into a prison. The deafening bass of the string quartet echoed through the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, a glittering cage where Clara was paraded as Victor's newest, most compliant acquisition. The annual Remington Charity Gala was a masterclass in performative philanthropy, teeming with sharks in custom tuxedos and women drowning in conflict-free diamonds. Escaping the suffocating weight of 100 judgmental stares, Clara slipped onto the secluded terrace, only to find the crisp autumn air immediately poisoned by the presence of her father. "You look every bit the dutiful little wife, Clara, but don't forget who put you in that silk dress," Mr. Hayes hissed, stepping out from the shadows with a predatory gleam in his eyes that made her stomach churn. "I need the encryption keys to Victor's offshore accounts by tomorrow, or I swear to God I will pull the plug on your mother's ventilator myself." Clara stared at the man whose DNA she shared, feeling a profound, liberating surge of absolute disgust replace her lifelong fear. "If you ever go near her, I will personally hand Victor the evidence of your embezzlement," she countered, her voice dropping to a lethal, unwavering whisper as she stood her ground. "I am done paying for your sins, Father, and I will not help you steal from him again." She turned her back on him and walked away, her heels clicking decisively against the stone, completely unaware of the security camera discreetly blinking in the corner above them. Victor watched her re-enter the ballroom, his analytical mind instantly registering the pale tightness of her features and the fierce protective spark burning in her eyes. He had spent the last 2 weeks actively trying to break her spirit with grueling administrative tasks, yet she continuously defied his expectations, quietly fixing his broken code while enduring his cold cruelty without a single complaint. "We are leaving," he announced abruptly, gripping her elbow with a firmness that was meant for the cameras, but felt surprisingly grounding to Clara's trembling body. "You look like you are about to faint, and a public collapse is not on the itinerary for this evening's performance." He didn't wait for her response, guiding her swiftly through the sea of elite guests and down the private VIP elevator toward the desolate underground parking garage. The descent was consumed by a heavy, charged silence, the space between them vibrating with the unspoken tension that had been building since the moment he forced that ring onto her finger. Clara leaned against the cold metal wall of the elevator, her heart still racing from the confrontation with her father, desperately wishing she could just tell Victor the truth about the danger they were both in. She glanced at his sharp, unforgiving profile, knowing that the man who had bought her life to punish her sister would never believe that she was actually trying to save his empire. The subterranean parking garage was a cavernous expanse of concrete and flickering fluorescent lights, echoing with the hollow sound of their footsteps as they approached the waiting black Maybach. Victor released her arm to reach for the door handle, his focus momentarily shifting, which was the exact fraction of a second the assassin had been waiting for. A sharp, metallic click echoed through the damp air, a sound Clara instantly recognized from her paranoid, hypervigilant days spent navigating the dark web's criminal underbelly. "Victor, get down!" she screamed, acting on pure, unthinking instinct as she threw her entire body weight against his solid frame, shoving him violently toward the concrete floor. The silenced crack of a gunshot shattered the quiet of the garage, the bullet shattering the passenger side window just inches from where Victor's head had been a heartbeat before. A searing, white-hot line of agony tore through Clara's upper arm, ripping a gasp from her throat as they both crashed onto the harsh pavement amidst a shower of broken safety glass. Victor rolled instantly, his body instinctively covering hers as a protective shield, his hand diving inside his jacket to draw the concealed weapon he always carried. He fired twice into the shadows, the deafening roar of his gun sending the dark-clad assailant fleeing into the labyrinth of parked cars, leaving a terrifying, ringing silence in their wake. "Clara," Victor breathed, his voice a hoarse, unrecognizable rasp of sheer panic as he looked down at the woman pinned beneath him. The invulnerable, ruthless billionaire was entirely gone, completely shattered by the sight of dark crimson blood rapidly staining the pristine white silk of her designer evening gown. "You took a bullet for me," he whispered, staring at her pale face with wide, disbelieving gray eyes, his brilliant mind utterly failing to process why the gold-digging traitor he despised would sacrifice her own life to save his. "It's just a graze, Victor. I'm fine," she gritted out through clenched teeth, her hand instinctively pressing against the burning wound on her arm to stem the bleeding. "Don't be an idiot. You are bleeding," he snapped, fear masquerading as anger as he quickly shrugged off his expensive tuxedo jacket and pressed it firmly against her injury. He scooped her up from the broken glass as if she weighed absolutely nothing, his heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against her chest as he carried her toward the private security elevator. Every single assumption he had made about Clara Hayes was currently burning to the ground, leaving him adrift in a chaotic sea of guilt, confusion, and a sudden, fierce possessiveness he had never felt before. "Stay with me, Clara," he commanded, his jaw tight as he hit the emergency override button, watching her eyes flutter shut as the adrenaline began to wear off. He bypassed the hospital entirely, knowing that a gunshot wound would trigger a police investigation and a media frenzy that neither of them could afford right now. Instead, he carried her straight into the master suite of the penthouse, laying her gently onto the edge of the massive marble bathtub, while he retrieved his extensive military-grade first aid kit. The sheer, terrifying vulnerability of the situation completely stripped away the toxic power dynamics of their marriage, leaving only two people breathing heavily in a brightly lit room. "This is going to hurt," Victor warned softly, his voice devoid of its usual icy edge as he carefully cut the ruined silk sleeve away from her shoulder to expose the angry, bleeding gash. He cleaned the wound with a practiced, ruthless efficiency, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as they moved over her shivering skin. Clara bit her lip to stifle a whimper, her uninjured hand gripping the edge of the cold marble until her knuckles turned pure white. "Why did you do it, Clara?" he asked, his gaze lifting to meet hers, the question heavy with a desperate need for the truth. "Why would you risk everything for a man who has done nothing but lock you in a cage and treat you like garbage?" "Because you are not the monster you pretend to be, Victor," Clara answered, her voice shaky but ringing with an absolute, undeniable conviction that pierced straight through his armor. She looked deep into his tormented gray eyes, letting her own carefully constructed walls of stoic endurance finally crumble to dust. "Because, despite everything you've done to me, I know that you built your empire to protect people, and I couldn't just let someone take that away from you." The raw, unvarnished honesty of her words hit him harder than the bullet ever could, fracturing the very foundation of his deeply ingrained cynicism and deep-seated paranoia. He stared at her, at the brave, brilliant, bleeding woman sitting in his bathroom, and felt a tidal wave of crushing regret and intense, undeniable longing wash over him. "I have been such a blind, arrogant fool," he whispered, a ragged sound of pure self-loathing escaping his chest as he finished securing the crisp, white bandage around her arm. He didn't pull away. Instead, he stayed kneeling between her legs, his hands coming up to gently cup her face, his thumbs wiping away a stray tear that had escaped her eyes. The air in the room grew unbearably thick, charged with a magnetic, consuming energy that had been brewing in the shadows since the moment she had signed that damned contract. The distance between them vanished, obliterated by the overwhelming collision of near-death adrenaline and weeks of suffocating, repressed desire. Victor leaned in and captured her lips, not with the punishing cruelty of their wedding day, but with a desperate, starving reverence that stole the very breath from her lungs. It was a kiss of profound apology, a feverish, messy exploration that begged for forgiveness and demanded everything she had left to give. Clara let out a soft, surrendered gasp, her uninjured arm wrapping tightly around his neck as she melted against his solid, reassuring heat, finally allowing herself to feel the terrifying depth of her own attraction to him. He groaned, standing up and pulling her effortlessly against his chest, lifting her off the cold marble and carrying her toward the center of the vast, shadowy bedroom. The contract, the lies, the sister, the debt, everything burned away in the consuming fire of their shared desperation, leaving only the undeniable, primal truth of their physical connection. They fell onto the tangled sheets in a frantic tangle of limbs and breathless whispers, the careful boundaries of their fake marriage completely annihilated. For the first time in his meticulously controlled life, Victor Remington surrendered to the absolute chaos of needing someone, burying his face in the crook of her neck as she anchored him to the world. The pale gray light of the Manhattan dawn filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the tangled bed where Clara slept, her head resting securely on Victor's chest. He lay perfectly awake, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist, listening to the soft, steady rhythm of her breathing, as a profound sense of protective fury settled deep in his bones. He gently untangled himself from her embrace, quietly pulling on a pair of sweatpants and walking out to the living room, where his encrypted tablet was silently blinking with an incoming high-priority message from his chief of security. It was the raw security footage from the Pierre Hotel's terrace, a silent, grainy video that clearly showed Mr. Hayes cornering Clara in the shadows, his face twisted in a vicious sneer. Victor maximized the audio enhancement, his blood turning to absolute ice as he heard the faint, distinct threat about pulling the plug on her mother's ventilator. The horrific truth crashed down on him with the force of a freight train. Clara wasn't an accomplice who had greedily signed his contract for money, but a desperate hostage who had sacrificed herself to save her mother. He gripped the edge of the glass coffee table until his knuckles turned white, a dark, lethal promise forming in his mind as he realized he had spent weeks torturing the only innocent person in this entire twisted game. The digital interface of the Remington Tower's internal server hummed with a quiet, menacing blue light as Clara, her injured arm throbbing with a dull, rhythmic ache, expertly navigated the final layer of encryption. She had spent the last 3 hours meticulously documenting the financial trail that led directly from her father's private shell company to the offshore accounts of the very rival firm that had hired the hitman in the parking garage. Every line of code she bypassed was a nail in the coffin of the Hayes family's elaborate deception, a systematic dismantling of the web that had trapped her in this hellish contract. She hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, and hadn't looked back, her entire existence reduced to this singular pursuit of the truth that would finally, irrevocably set her free. Just as the file transfer completed, the heavy doors of the office swung open, and Victor strode in, his face a complex mosaic of raw, agonizing guilt and a terrifying protective ferocity that she had never seen before. "Clara, get away from that computer immediately. I know everything," Victor stated, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that caused every tiny hair on the back of her neck to stand up. He didn't approach her with the cold, detached menace of a jailer, but with a frantic, desperate energy, his eyes searching hers for the woman he had so ruthlessly misjudged and destroyed over the past few weeks. Clara didn't move her hand, still hovering over the keyboard, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm as she realized that he had finally uncovered the secret behind the missing millions and her father's true, treacherous intent. You know everything, or you know just enough to realize that your revenge was founded on a lie. She countered, her voice icy, devoid of the submissive, compliant tone he had grown accustomed to over the last month. Victor stopped mid-stride, his expression fracturing under the weight of his own monstrous realization. The cold, calculating billionaire, completely eclipsed by a man drowning in a sea of his own making. I know you are the woman who saved my life, in ways I don't even deserve. And I know your father is the one who orchestrated this entire nightmare to destroy me, he confessed, his voice breaking as he closed the distance between them, ignoring the professional boundaries he had strictly enforced until this very moment. He reached out his hand, trembling as he caught her chin, forcing her to look at him, to see the raw, exposed agony he was currently experiencing. I have been a monster, Clara, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I have already dispatched my security team to the farm. Your father is currently being intercepted before he can leave the state. Clara felt the icy, protective shell she had worn like a second skin over the past few weeks begin to crack. The sheer intensity of his desperation, an overwhelming, intoxicating force that she was no longer capable of resisting. She saw the man. He was behind the corporate mask. The man who would burn down his own world to ensure her safety. And the anger that had fueled her survival began to dissolve into a terrifying, unfamiliar longing. You don't get to play the hero now, Victor. Not after you treated me like a disposable pawn for months, she stated, her voice shaking as she pulled away from his touch. The pain in her arm, a sharp reminder of the cost of their union. He didn't try to stop her, his hands dropping to his sides, his face a mask of weary, profound defeat as he finally understood the permanence of the damage he had inflicted upon her soul. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Clara. I'm asking for the chance to burn the entire corrupt structure down, including my own family if they are involved, to ensure you are safe, he said, his tone resolute, a promise etched in stone. He turned toward his desk and hit the intercom button, his voice instantly reverting to its sharp, cold corporate precision as he ordered his legal team to prepare the documents for the total destruction of the Hayes assets. It was a calculated, lethal strike, a move that would leave her father with absolutely nothing but the cold concrete walls of a federal penitentiary, an act of vengeance that felt both necessary and deeply uncomfortably personal. Suddenly, his private phone rang, the shrill, jarring sound cutting through the thick, suffocating tension in the room, making them both jump. He answered it, his expression darkening into a mask of pure, unadulterated horror as he listened to the voice on the other end of the line. It's him, isn't it? Clara asked. Her voice, a calm, chilling realization, her mind already calculating the inevitable conclusion of this high-stakes game. Victor hung up, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of rage and terror that made her blood run cold. Your father didn't act alone. He was in league with the very board members I trusted to oversee this merger, and they have Isabella hostage, he revealed, his hands clenching into white-knuckled fists at his sides. They know we have the data, and they've set a meeting at the old shipyard for tonight. They want the encryption keys, or they kill her, and then they come for us. Clara felt a wave of cold, sharp determination wash over her, a familiar feeling from her hidden life as a systems analyst, a thrill of impending battle. She looked at the man who had been her torturer, her husband, and now her sole ally, and saw in his eyes the same unwavering resolve to protect the woman he finally understood as his equal. "We aren't going to give them the keys, Victor," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound dangerous confidence. "We are going to give them a ghost in the machine that will systematically dismantle their entire operation while we walk out of there with my sister alive." Victor stared at her, utterly speechless, his brilliant logical mind finally comprehending that he hadn't just married a soft-hearted, compliant woman. He had married a woman who was a mastermind, capable of outmaneuvering his most powerful enemies. A slow, proud smile spread across his face, a look of profound, intoxicating respect, as he understood, for the very first time, that they were not just enemies, but the most lethal partnership New York had ever seen. The shipyard was a desolate, fog-shrouded expanse of rusted metal and dark, looming cranes, the air smelling of salt, grease, and impending violence. Victor guided Clara toward the heart of the structure, his hand never leaving the small of her back, his body a solid, immovable shield against the shadows that seemed to watch them from every corner. They arrived exactly at the stroke of midnight, the agreed-upon time for the trade. The weight of the encrypted drive in Clara's hand feeling like a ticking bomb waiting to explode. A group of 4 men, their faces obscured by the thick gray mist, emerged from behind a massive container, their weapons raised with the casual, terrifying ease of professional killers. At their center stood her father, his face twisted in a mask of desperate, pathetic greed, clearly unaware that he was just another disposable variable in their lethal game. "Do you have the data, or does your sister die right here?" "Rather how?" her father demanded, his voice shaking with a tremor of pure, unadulterated cowardice. Clara stepped forward, her gaze unwavering, while Victor moved with the silent, deadly grace of a panther, his eyes scanning for the sniper he knew had to be positioned somewhere in the rafters. "The data is here, but before I hand it over, I want to see Isabella," she insisted, her voice calm, projecting the absolute confidence of a woman who was currently playing a much, much larger game. One of the men shoved Isabella forward. She was disheveled, terrified, but alive, her eyes wide with shock as she saw Clara standing there, dressed in a sharp professional suit and looking far more powerful than she had ever seen her. "Now hand it over," her father screeched, his patience completely evaporated, his hands trembling as he reached for the drive. Clara hesitated for a split second, a micro-expression of hesitation that was part of her meticulously orchestrated performance, and in that exact heartbeat, Victor unleashed his private security detail. A barrage of non-lethal, high-velocity flashbangs detonated, turning the dark shipyard into a blinding, disorienting void of white light and deafening, high-pitched noise. In the ensuing chaotic scramble, Clara moved with the speed of a master, lunging for Isabella and pulling her toward the protective circle of Victor's security team. Victor stood at the center of the madness, his eyes locked on the snipers as they attempted to realign their shots. His calm, tactical commands cutting through the pandemonium like a blade. Within seconds, the assailants were pinned to the cold, wet concrete, their weapons stripped, their entire operation systematically neutralized by Victor's elite surgical strike. Mr. Hayes stood frozen, his face a portrait of utter, pathetic defeat as the handcuffs were clicked shut around his wrists, his dreams of fleeing with a fortune ending in the ignominious shadow of a rusting ship. Clara stood by the container, Isabella clinging to her arm, her eyes fixed on Victor as he approached them, the adrenaline-fueled tension of the night slowly beginning to ebb away. He looked exhausted, his tuxedo covered in grime and shipyard dust, his eyes burning with an intense, raw emotion that he no longer made any attempt to disguise. "Are you hurt, Clara?" he asked, his voice low and ragged, his gaze scanning her body with a terrifying protective obsession. She shook her head, the weight of the last few months finally starting to lift, leaving behind a clear, sharp understanding of who they were to each other now. He reached out and wrapped his arms around both of them, pulling them into a tight, crushing embrace that was both an apology and a promise of sanctuary. For the first time, Clara felt truly, unconditionally safe. The cold, suffocating cage of their marriage finally shattered, leaving behind the possibility of a life built on truth. The sterile antiseptic scent of Montgomery General Hospital was entirely overwhelmed by the extravagant, blooming arrangement of white orchids that Victor had personally ordered for the private VIP recovery suite. Clara sat in the plush armchair beside her mother's bed, watching the steady, reassuring rhythm of the state-of-the-art ventilator that was now permanently funded by the Remington estate. A profound wave of relief, finally washing the perpetual anxiety from her weary bones. Isabella sat on the opposite side, her hands trembling slightly as she held their unconscious mother's fingers. The younger girl still processing the horrific reality that their own father had offered her life as collateral in a multi-million-dollar corporate espionage ring. "The doctors have assured me that the new specialist team will initiate the experimental treatment protocols by tomorrow morning, and they are highly optimistic about her response." Victor's deep, resonant voice broke the quiet hum of the room as he stepped through the door, his imposing frame clad in a dark, bespoke suit that commanded absolute authority. He didn't hover awkwardly near the entrance. Instead, he walked directly to Clara's side, his large hand coming to rest on her shoulder in a gesture of natural, unhesitating support that sent a warm, grounding tremor straight to her core. Clara looked up at the man who had transitioned from her ruthless captor to her most fiercely loyal protector. The sharp gray ice of his eyes now completely thawed into a pool of quiet, unwavering devotion. The transition back to the corporate battlefield of Remington Tower the following morning was a masterclass in absolute, unadulterated power. But this time, the dynamics had fundamentally and irrevocably shifted. Clara did not return to the subterranean, windowless cubicle of the junior clerks. Instead, she walked step for step beside Victor into the executive boardroom, wearing a tailored crimson designer suit that radiated the undeniable authority of a true partner. The remaining board members, some of whom had been secretly allied with her corrupt father, sat in a terrified, suffocating silence as Victor took his position at the head of the massive mahogany table, his presence suffocating the room with a lethal, predatory calm. Over the past 48 hours, it has come to my attention that a select faction of this board has been actively facilitating offshore embezzlement, utilizing my wife's family as a convenient, disposable scapegoat, Victor announced, his voice slicing through the air like a perfectly honed scalpel. He didn't shout, but the sheer glacial menace in his tone made two of the senior vice presidents physically shrink back into their leather chairs, their faces draining of all color. He gestured to Clara, his eyes shining with a dark, intoxicating pride, as she stepped forward, connecting her customized, encrypted laptop to the central holographic display unit with the confident grace of an apex predator. The boardroom erupted into frantic, panicked whispers as Clara displayed the decrypted financial logs, the undeniable, irrefutable proof of their treason, glowing in high-definition blue light for everyone to witness. Every ghost account, every manipulated algorithmic trade, and every unauthorized wire transfer has been systematically tracked, indexed, and forwarded directly to the federal authorities, Clara stated, her voice projecting a cool, lethal calm that mirrored Victor's legendary demeanor. She watched the arrogant men who had plotted to destroy her husband's empire squirm in their seats, knowing that she had single-handedly dismantled a conspiracy that would have taken a team of forensic accountants years to unravel. Victor watched her command the room, his chest tightening with an overwhelming surge of profound respect and an agonizing, desperate love that he had never expected to feel in his highly regulated life. Security is waiting in the lobby to escort the individuals named on this list directly into police custody. The rest of you will be subject to a comprehensive, invasive internal audit, effective immediately. Victor finalized, slamming the heavy leather folder shut with a resounding thud that echoed like a gunshot. As the disgraced executives were unceremoniously marched out of the room, Victor turned his full, intense focus back to Clara, the formidable CEO, mask slipping just enough to reveal the awestruck, deeply devoted man underneath. That evening, the Remington penthouse was cloaked in the soft, melancholic hum of a heavy New York rainstorm, the raindrops tracing chaotic, glittering paths across the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the sprawling metropolis. Clara stood by the glass, a glass of expensive amber whiskey in her hand, staring out at the bleeding neon lights and reflecting on the surreal, terrifying, and ultimately beautiful trajectory of the last month. The heavy oak door of the master suite clicked open, and Victor stepped into the dimly lit living room, having finally shed his suit jacket and tie, looking exhausted but stripped of the heavy burdens that had haunted him for years. He walked silently toward the hidden panel behind the abstract painting, his thumb pressing against the biometric scanner with a soft chime retrieving the sleek black leather folder that contained the very contract that had initially bound them together in hatred. When I forced you to sign this document, I was a man consumed by betrayal, convinced that the entire world was a transaction, and that love was merely a liability waiting to be exploited, Victor said, his voice a low, rough rasp as he stopped a few feet away from her. He looked down at the harsh, draconian clauses he had authored, a look of profound physical revulsion crossing his handsome features as he confronted the monster he had allowed himself to become. He held the folder out to her, the heavy, expensive paper feeling like a lead weight in the charged electric space between them, his gray eyes searching hers with a terrifying, raw vulnerability. You are not a hostage, Clara, and you are no longer bound by your sister's debts, your father's crimes, or the cruel, paranoid rules of a man who didn't know how to trust, Victor stated, his voice breaking slightly as he laid his entire soul bare for her to judge. The funds for your mother's care have been placed in an irrevocable blind trust. She will be cared for permanently, regardless of what you choose to do next. He took a deep, shaky breath, the invincible billionaire willingly handing over the absolute power he had wielded, offering her the ultimate unconditional freedom to walk out the door and never look back. You can take this contract, tear it to pieces, and walk away into the life you deserve. And I swear to you, I will never do anything to stand in your way, he whispered, the agonizing fear of losing her warring with his desperate need to do the right thing. Clara stared at the leather folder, her mind flashing back to the freezing, terrifying night she had signed away her life, contrasting it with the fierce, protective man who had thrown his body over hers to take a bullet. Slowly, deliberately, Clara set her whiskey glass down on the marble side table, her eyes never leaving his as she took the heavy black folder from his trembling hands. She didn't open it to read the oppressive clauses again. Instead, she gripped the thick parchment and ripped it cleanly in half, the sharp sound of tearing paper echoing loudly in the quiet, rain-swept penthouse. Vere's breath hitched a look of stunned, paralyzing shock, freezing his features as the pieces of the shattered contract fluttered harmlessly to the floor, landing like discarded, meaningless debris. I didn't survive a corrupt corporate conspiracy, a shootout in a parking garage, and a month of your terrible attitude just to walk away when things finally get interesting, Victor? Clara said, a slow, beautiful smile spreading across her face as she stepped into his personal space. She reached up her fingers, tangling in the soft, dark hair at the nape of his neck, feeling the frantic, relieved hammering of his pulse against her palms. You might have bought a wife to be a punching bag, but what you actually got was a partner, and I am not going anywhere, she murmured, her voice thick with a profound, undeniable love that completely obliterated the last remnants of his icy fortress. A deep, guttural groan tore from Victor's throat as the crushing weight of his fear instantly vanished, replaced by an intoxicating tidal wave of pure, unadulterated salvation. He wrapped his strong arms around her waist, pulling her flesh against his chest and lifting her slightly off the ground, burying his face in the crook of her neck as if she were the only oxygen left in his atmosphere. I love you, Clara. He breathed against her skin, the words feeling foreign but absolutely, undeniably right. A sacred vow that he had never spoken to anyone else in his entire life. I love you with every fractured, broken piece of my soul, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt it. He lifted his head and captured her lips in a kiss that held no reservations, no power plays, and no secrets. It was a desperate, hungry claiming that tasted of rain, whiskey, and the beautiful, chaotic promise of their future. Clara surrendered completely to the overwhelming heat of his mouth, her own hands gripping his shoulders as he carried her toward the bedroom, the heavy oak doors closing silently behind them, sealing away the ghosts of the past. 6 months later, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was fundamentally different, vibrating with the electric, joyous energy of the Remington Foundation's annual winter gala. Clara stood by the towering crystal champagne fountain, radiant in a breathtaking, custom-designed emerald gown, her posture reflecting the absolute confidence of a woman who fully owned her empire and her heart. Her mother, seated comfortably in a plush wheelchair nearby and recovering miraculously well, was laughing warmly with Isabella, the dark shadows of their family's past entirely banished by the brilliant light of their new reality. Victor approached Clara from behind, seamlessly slipping his arm around her waist and pulling her back against his chest, completely ignoring the flashing cameras of the paparazzi, who were obsessed with the legendary, fiercely devoted power couple. Have I mentioned that you look absolutely terrifying and magnificent tonight, Mrs. Remington? He whispered, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to the bare skin of her shoulder, causing a delightful shiver to run down her spine. Clara leaned back into his embrace, her hand coming to rest over his, feeling the cool, solid weight of the diamond wedding band that was no longer a shackle, but a symbol of her greatest triumph. You might have mentioned it, Mr. Remington, but I highly suggest you keep reminding me, she teased, turning her head to capture his lips in a slow, promising kiss that told the entire watching world that the cage had not just been broken, it had been conquered by love.